Thanks, everybody. Hey. Okay. I want to talk today about a bunch of things. I want to talk about the 1890s. I want to talk about some elections. I want to talk about lynching. And I want to talk about the populists. And the thing that's disturbing about the American South is that we see the populist movement and the rise of lynching at the same time. And a lot of people have tried to figure out why this is, what's the relationship between these two things. And I don't have an answer for this, but I do want to kind of give you a sense of what's going on in the South in relationship to race in the period after, say, 1876. And to do that, we need to start, as we always do, with cotton. And cotton's important here because this is the cotton South, much of it, where we're in Georgia. There's a tobacco South in Virginia and Maryland. But it's the cotton South where we see the most violence. And we also see an economy that can't seem to escape from cotton. And the significance of this is it's important to understand this because the South does not catch up with the rest of the country in part because of cotton. So let's look at per capita income here. This is per capita income as a percentage of the U.S. average. And as you can see, in 1880 to 1900, the per capita income in the South Atlantic, which is where we are, is 45% of the U.S. average income. Now, partly this is because people are there are a lot of sharecroppers in these regions, and they're making very little money. But a lot of it has to do with cotton itself, the fact that the price of this is declining. It's really not until after 1900 that we start to see a surge of incomes in the South, but it doesn't really reach, Southern incomes don't reach U.S. per capita income anywhere close to it until about 1980. So the South is really very far behind other places. And this has all sorts of indirect effects. It means that there's a brain drain for folks leaving the South because it's so poor. It means that this continuing poverty in the South partly explains why there are no buildings over 4 stories in the South outside of a couple buildings in Atlanta by 1900. While there are many such buildings in Chicago and New York. The other feature that we need to recognize is that there is something called a solid South by 1876. And that is, if we look at voting patterns, the South is solidly voting the Democratic Party. And as I said before, the politicians used to say, North and South, vote as you shot. That is that white Northerners or Northerners should continue to vote for the Union Army. White Southerners should continue to vote for the Democratic Party, and so that white Northerners would vote Republican, white Southerners would vote Democrat. Now that's not entirely true in much of the North, as you see Nevada, California, New York, Indiana. There are places where there's some variation in political parties. The North is not solidly Republican, even in the period of 1876 to 1892. But the South is pretty much solidly Democratic. And that's especially true, though, in Democratic elections. It's not in presidential elections. It's not necessarily true at the local level. By 1888, we start to see a movement that is a third-party movement that's called variously the Farmers Alliance, the People's Party, the Populist Party, and their first stab in kind of presidential elections is the 1888 election, in which the populist Weaver emerges. And as you can see early on, the populist movement does expand in the South, but they're not capable of assuming power in the South. They are capable, though, of assuming power in places like Nevada, like Colorado. They're up there in North Dakota. So they're still around. They're still an important. They're emerging as a somewhat important Party. Now, let's talk a little bit about the populists and what they're up to. The populists are concerned about the economic problems in the South, particularly as connected to cotton. And my green screen is all messed up here. There we go. So here is just to give us a sense of where the populists are stronger in the 1880s and 1890s. The Populist Party is especially strong in the middle border. Let me talk a little bit about the populists. So what do the populists want? They want national regulation of the railroads because they believe that the railroads are too powerful. They even support nationalization of the railroads. As we talked about on the Zoom call on Friday, Germany nationalizes its railroads. France nationalized some of its railroads. And so there are other nationalizations that are taking place. And so the populists believe that these railroads should be taken over by the federal government. They believe that there should be reform in this growing federal government. They believe in a system of banking that is not connected to the old system of banking or the system of banking that emerges in 1862 and 63, which is very, very strongly connected to the Northeast. They want a banking system that's more broadly accessible, and so they support a series of postal banks that are based in post offices where people could write checks and things like that. They also believe in direct election of senators. And finally, the populists support broadly inflation. Okay, so one of the things we talked about before was deflation, right? And deflation is where your money is worth more and more over time. And if your money is worth more and more over time, if $20 is worth more and more over time, it's very difficult to escape from debts that way because to pay off those debts, it gets harder and harder. So that's a big issue, and silver is connected with inflation. Now let me talk a little bit about why that is. Remember before we said that the gold that's mined is the amount of gold that's being mined is increasing, but not as fast as the population. So if you are on a gold standard, the amount of money is likely to be somewhat shrinking, and that's going to lead to deflation. And for complicated reasons. If you're locked in, basically, if your currency is locked in on gold, which the U.S. is becoming by 76, then your money is going to be worth more and more over time. The people who like that are people who have a lot of capital because their wealth is worth more. They can buy more with it. The people who are unhappy with this are debtors, and that's mostly farmers. So there are a lot of farmers who believe that there should be inflation, and the way to do that is to move to silver. And the reason that they want silver, the reason that silver could lead to inflation is because there's a whole lot more silver that's being discovered and mined by the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is important because if we look at where the populists are strong, they're strong in the middle border, what's called the middle border, from North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas, which are big wheat areas. But they're also powerful. They're powerful in North Dakota for another reason. Because North Dakota, Colorado, Nevada, and Idaho also have lots and lots of silver. So there's a whole lot of silver that's coming, that's emerging in this period, and Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, and North Dakota are silver states. So to answer Claire's question, what's the demographics that make up the Populist Party? By and large, it's a party of farmers, although it does have support in mining regions. But the demographic situation, I think, is suggested by this map here. The places where farmers are most likely to join the Populist Party are not throughout the United States. Look, there are a lot of farmers in Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa, but they're not in the Populist Party. The places where people tend to be populists are places where there's one crop. Okay? So that middle border from North Dakota through Nebraska and Kansas, that is a wheat belt. You can't grow anything but wheat on those Great Plains there. Corn can't be shipped long enough or far enough away. This is really the wheat belt, and these people are stuck in wheat. And the trouble with wheat is that wheat prices are going down. From 1870, they're at 106 cents a bushel. By 1900, they're 60 cents a bushel. Now, just because the commodity price goes down doesn't mean that everybody suffers, but small farmers especially suffer. So if you're a small farmer, you've settled in North Dakota, you've got 40 acres, you're growing wheat and you're selling it, 1870 to 1900 is not a good time for you, right? You've got deflation. And in addition to this, and probably connected to this, is the wheat prices are going down. Now, not everybody is hurt by this. If you're a large farmer, you've got a lot of steam-powered combines and a combination reaper. You don't need a whole lot of labor to grow your crop. Then you might be sitting pretty, even though wheat prices are declining. You're not happy about it, but you're still doing well. So farms were becoming very, very productive over this period. The man hours to produce a bushel of wheat in 1840 was 35 man hours to produce a bushel of wheat. By 1900, it's 15 man hours to produce a bushel of wheat. So it's requiring less and less labor. But if you can't afford steam combines, if you can't afford all of the other things that make it more cost effective, then you're going to be hurt by this. And so there are lots of people who get homesteads who fail in the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas, and those people who fail are sometimes populists, and those people who are on the verge of failing, who are farmers who are just making a go of it. So to answer Claire's question about the demographics, they tend to be poorer farmers. Their leadership tends to be fairly well-off farmers, but the people who vote populist tend to be poorer farmers, but wheat farmers. The other kind of farmer that's likely to join the Populist Party are cotton farmers. And that's why you see the Populist Party is relatively strong in the Deep South. Not in Virginia, not in West Virginia, not even in South Carolina, but Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida are going to have a fairly strong populist presence. Up to 15% of the population are going to be populists, and that's going to be black and white populists. People who believe that there's something broken about the railroad system, who believe that a third party is necessary. Does that make sense? Who's the populists? So the populists tend to be... Now let me talk just a little bit about farmers in these other places like Iowa, Illinois, Indiana. Folks who are farmers in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio can grow corn or wheat or raise hogs. And they can raise hogs and grow corn at the same time. And if hog prices go up and corn prices go down, they take the corn and they feed it to the hogs, they fatten the hogs and sell the hogs. If pork prices drop and corn prices go up, they're likely to sell their corn harvest. So a lot of farmers who are in multiple crops are less likely to be populists. But if you're in one crop, if you're a region that's really a one crop region, like the Deep South is, or like the middle border is, then you're more likely to be a populist. Does that make sense? So the populists are partly responsible for the couple of Democratic presidents that we have. So in 1892, the election of Cleveland is in part because of the subtraction of populist votes. So the populists are in green there, and this helps Cleveland win against Harrison in 1892. It's also true in the 1888 election. Where are we? Nope, that's 96. I don't have the 1888 election. There's the 1888. So also in the 1888 election, we see that the populists are pulling away potential presidential votes from the Republicans, and this does help the Democrats win. Although the Democrats likely would have won if we look at the Electoral College votes anyways. 1896, though, is the peak of the populist movement. And that's William Jennings Bryan from the Dakotas, who his famous speech at the 1896 convention, he's supported both by the Populist Party and by the Democratic Party. He said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon this cross of gold." So this attachment to the gold standard is leading to more and more deflation, according to Bryan, that the money is worth more and more over time and makes it harder and harder for farmers. and he supports silver. The 1896 election is very close for a 19th century election. It's really only McKinley only gets 51% of the vote against Bryan, but Bryan does fail in 1896. And with the end of the 1896 election is really the end of the Populist Party. So the Populist Party, as I said, was interested in a lot of things: direct election of senators, regulation of the railroads, a banking system that was based in the post office. All those things are more or less dropped in the 1896 election, and the only issue by 1896 is silver. So some populists believe that McKinley kind of sold out the Populist Party by just going to silver and ignoring all the other issues of the populist movement. But back to the vision of the populists. So the populists are poor farmers in the South and the West. And I want to give you Saul Miller, who's a Republican, who hates the populists, his description of a populist meeting. He says they are anarchists, howlers, tramps, highwaymen, burglars, crazy men, wild-eyed men, men with unkempt and matted hair, men with long beards matted together with filth from their noses, men reeking with lice, men whose feet stank and the odor from under whose arms would have knocked down a bull. Brazen women, women with beards, women with voices like a gong, women with scrawny necks and dirty fingernails, women with their stockings out at the heels, women possessed of devils, gathered there and sweltered and stank for a whole week. Making speeches, quarreling, and fighting like cats in a backyard. Gray-haired, scrawny, yellow-skinned women appeared upon the stage dressed in hideous or indecent costumes and gave performances that disgusted the most hardened Calamityites, until even Jerry Simpson, that sockless Jerry Simpson of Kansas, even Jerry Simpson gagged and protested that the convention was too much of a circus. The gathering was so outlandish that each delegate imagined the others were burlesquing him. To wind up the whole thing, delegates were bought up like the hogs that they were. Yeah. All right. So that's the image of the populist movement. It's right. So this is the image of the populist movement. It's they don't like the Republicans and Democrats don't like the populist movement. They see them as a movement of poor people who are going to bring chaos to the South and to the West. The populist movement is not seen as much of a threat in New England because there are very few New Englanders, and even the upper Midwest, there are very few people who are in the populist movement. But there's a lot of concern about the populist movement as a kind of threatening third party. And that threat is felt most directly in the Deep South by people, I'm sorry you can't see the whole caption there for Henry Grady, by the people called the Bourbons. The Bourbons are this group of Southern Democrats who had emerged after the war, many of them Confederate generals, although not all of them, who basically run the South. And they run the South like a machine. And they're very uncomfortable with this populist party. And at the head of this, interestingly, is a man who never became a candidate for any election, and that's Henry Grady. As you know, probably, our journalism school is named after him. He's the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, so you can see that. And he's basically the chief intellectual for this group. It's called the Bourbon Triumvirate. For any of you students who did Georgia history, this is probably familiar. You probably heard about the Bourbon Triumvirate. These three folks, Joseph Brown, Alfred Colquitt, and John B. Gordon, who effectively ran the Georgia Democratic Party. Oh, it's bourbon, like in bourbon, yeah. And so the term bourbon is a funny term. It means... it goes back to, it's a reference to the French monarchists in the period after Napoleon. Yes, right, exactly. The French royal family. They support the French royal family. And so the bourbon, and the term is, and so what was said of the Bourbons in the 1880s in France was that they never learned, but they never forgot. Okay? So they never learned, but they never forgot. The people who kind of supported the old order were the Bourbons, who were had strong grievances and were willing to punish anyone who opposed them. And so when they called these people the Bourbons, that was not a term that they liked, because it sort of referred to an old support for the order exactly like reactionaries. But reactionaries who are powerful, who are very well connected and very tightly knit together. So it's not just people who want to turn the clock back, because they don't exactly want to turn the clock back, but they're going to call on the borrowed language and disguise of the old order that they no longer represent. So this is why they dress in Confederate uniforms, even when they're at political events and things like that. This is why the kind of appeal of the old Confederacy is to call on that legacy of an order which they don't fully believe in, because the Bourbons, by and large, want a new South, right? And so Henry Grady is the spokesman for the new South. He wants a South that has lots of textile mills. He wants a South that's not, that recognizes that slavery is over. So that's what the Bourbons are about. And the Bourbons do not like these third parties. The Bourbons are threatened by these third parties because in the 1870s period, when it's illegal to discriminate under the Civil Rights Act against black voters, black people are still voting in the 70s and 80s. And the populists, as the Bourbons see it, are stirring the pot, right? They're attracting black voters to their side. And so we get the Greenback Labor Party in 1876. We get the Farmers Alliance in 1875. Both of these parties have black members in them. They run black candidates. The Readjuster Party in Virginia in 1870, mid to late 1870s, has black and white folks together against the Democratic Party. The fusionist Republicans in North Carolina that have some that will support Democrats for the national level, but Republicans at the state level, and then Democrats again at the local level, along with Republicans at the local level. So that Democrats in a split ticket. So these fusionist Republicans are willing to kind of there have black political leaders and white political leaders who sort of bang together around these issues of the unfairness of the railroads, of the power of the Bourbons, the difficulty with cotton. Yeah, the Bourbons were against third parties because they gave more rooms for African Americans to vote, but they also worried about losing power, because many of these third parties don't entirely lead the Democratic Party. They say you can vote for a Democratic president. I understand that you believe that the Republicans at the national level are criminal, right? You don't like the Republicans. You can support a Democratic president, but at the state level, you should support this third party. So the Bourbons feared that people would be Democrats at the national level, but not support them at the state and the local level. So they feared their loss. They feared a loss of power by a kind of unity. They recognized that the Republicans would never, going to be a powerful force in the 70s and 80s. But these fusion parties, or these third parties, had a threat of bringing African American voters out. And so as the Bourbons see it, the big threat, and this is exactly what Claire's point is, the big threat is black voters. And so this is where we get disfranchisement. It's the Bourbons. So it starts with the Supreme Court. In the civil rights cases, in 1883, the Supreme Court says that the federal government cannot overturn state laws that have the effect of depriving people of rights. Now, the Supreme Court decisions in 1883 do a couple of other things. They basically invalidate the Civil Rights Act of 1875. No, the populists were not Republicans. The populists hated the Republicans because the Republicans supported the gold standard mostly. And the populists didn't like the Democrats because they thought that the Democrats were basically the party of the old secessionists. So the populists were a third party that wanted inflation. Even Democrats, there were gold Democrats and silver Democrats. There were gold Republicans and silver Republicans too. So it's a little more complicated than this. But the populists were not Republicans. As the populists saw it, the Republican Party was the party of the elite North, and the Democrats were the party of the elite South, and they were the not the elites at all. So the populists really were a kind of third party, really were a kind of party of poor and middling farmers. It's really more of a social movement in some ways than a party, Henry. So that's a great question, though. So the Supreme Court in the civil rights cases, but just that said, in the Southern Democrats in the South said the populists were Republicans, and the Northern Republicans in the North said that populists were Democrats. So each of both the Republicans and the Democrats who feared losing power in those regions each claimed that the other was, the populists represented the other party. But in fact, the populists represented poor, many kind of working farmers and others who were irritated by this system. Okay, so the civil rights cases in 1883 they say that the federal government cannot overturn state laws because they have the effect of depriving people of their rights. Okay, so if the state of Georgia says black people can't vote, that's going to be struck down by the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment does not allow you to say that black people can't vote. But the civil rights cases do say that if it has the effect of preventing black people from voting, then that's maybe okay. Right. So this is where we get separate but equal is going to emerge a little bit later in this period, but basically what the Supreme Court says is as long as your law doesn't state that it prevents black people from voting, then it's fine, because states can do what they want. Henry Grady loves this decision, and Henry Grady in 1885 starts to create a plan to keep the Bourbons in power because of the threats from 1876 all the way to 1909 of these third parties, like the populists and others, that are campaigning on, regulating the railroads and whatever. So what he says is that we can use intelligence, character, and property to block people from voting. Because intelligence, character, and property doesn't say race in it. Okay? And so that's where we get what's called the Mississippi Plan. The Mississippi Plan is basically the understanding clause and the poll tax. The understanding clause this is the Mississippi Constitution, the first one to pass this in 1890, and it says you have to, if you want to be able to vote, you have to be shown a section of the Constitution of Mississippi or the U.S. Constitution and explain it. You have to read it and explain it. And if you can read it and explain it, then you can vote. And if you can't read it, or you can read it and you can't explain it, you can't vote. And this is designed to basically prevent African Americans from voting. You come to the courthouse, someone is a poll taker, is basically a poll official who's there. Even if you are an educated African American, you're very likely to be rejected at the poll for not having properly understood this extremely complicated section of the Mississippi Constitution, whereas white people. So it's an informal way of legally preventing black people from voting, the understanding clause. Does that make sense? And the other one is the poll tax. And the poll tax is basically a tax that's imposed to vote, a yearly tax that you have to pay to vote. And the thought is that African Americans are not going to pay this tax. And so this is a property requirement and basically an understanding requirement. The third one is the grandfather clause, which you've probably heard about. The grandfather clause is basically a backdoor for white people to vote. So if you can't maybe understand this section, and if you can't pay the poll tax, if your grandfather voted, then you're a respectable citizen and you can vote. You say this in 1890, that if your grandfather could vote, that you could vote. Obviously what this means, the effect of this, is, right, for if your grandfather was a slave, and if you're black, you're very and want to vote, that you're very likely true that your grandfather was a slave, then you can't vote. because your grandfather didn't vote. So the grandfather clause is an exception. But then if you're a poor white Southerner whose grandfather did vote in previous elections, and you don't necessarily have to pay the poll tax, or you might have to pay the poll tax, but you don't have to do the understanding clause. So this is what's called the Mississippi Plan of 1890. The architect of it is Henry Grady, the person who figures out how to do this, how to basically legally prevent black people from voting, but without actually saying that black people can't vote. That's Henry Grady's plan. And ironically, it's passed by the Mississippi legislature in 1890, the year after Grady dies. In 1885, he kind of lays out in the Atlanta Constitution how this can happen. And gradually, with constitutional conventions, yes, and this is where the term grandfathered initiated it comes from, is when you say you're grandfathered in, it means that there's a back door for you. You don't have to worry because of previous cases. And that's, in fact, exactly where the word grandfathered comes from, as I understand it. So this is where we get formal disfranchisement of African Americans. That basically so previously you've got something like as many as 50 or 40% of African Americans that are voting in the 1880s or so. By 1890 and afterwards, all the way up to 1901 and in, say, Virginia, 1901 in North Carolina, I forget when actually Georgia issues this, you get this creation of a new system that basically prevents black people from voting. And so at this point you have like 4 to 5% African American voting. It never fully eliminates every black person from voting, and in fact, if it did that, there might be more question or challenge to this, but it prevents most black people from voting in this period. And so between 1893 and 1901, all the states in the South adapt this constitutional conventions. So let's go back to this populism business, right? So populism is a threat politically to the Bourbon Democrats. The Bourbon Democrats come up with this basically way of keeping third parties from bringing black and white folks together in a third party that might overturn their power, and so they can block the populace. So that's part of what's going on for understanding why disfranchisement happens. Is that these Southern Bourbons, to protect their power, are increasingly blocking black and even some white voters from voting, because the poll tax actually does. There are some white Southerners that can't pay the poll tax that don't vote in places like Georgia. Yes. Well, why the disdain for? Why did they bother, though, if there was such disdain for poor whites? Were the poor whites voting Democrat with no problem? Yeah, the poor whites are voting Democrat in places like Mississippi and elsewhere. But the poll tax is very effective at blocking black voting. The fact that it also blocks white voting doesn't really bother them that much, if that makes the fact that it blocks poor white voting is just a sort of side effect as they see it. Why do they? Oh, I see. Why do they bother grandfathering them in? Oh, in places like Alabama and elsewhere, there's a tremendous opposition to the poll tax and the understanding clause by poor whites who are voting, and so basically to get them on the side of these constitutional amendments, they throw in the grandfather clause. So it's. And it's also there's a sense among white Southerners that everybody should be voting. So that's why the grandfathering is made as an exception. So when we say the grandfather clause disfranchises, it doesn't really disfranchise. It sort of enfranchises poor white Southerners who would otherwise be blocked from voting. But in places like Virginia, there is not a grandfather clause, and poor whites are blocked from voting. And political machines are actually much more powerful in Virginia, partly for that reason. Okay, so what does all this have to do with lynching? The Bourbon world, the world that's been created by the Bourbons in this period, is one that's very different from the South before the war. In the South before the war, black and white people are together a lot. In part because, on plantations, the people that are raising white children on plantations are, in fact, black women, right? every plantation house, there were black people inside, as servants and others. There were lots and lots of ways in which black and white people were interacting in small towns and elsewhere. There wasn't really segregation in the antebellum period. There couldn't have been. You have a plantation system is a kind of system in which pulls all these families together. There are, black people are living in one place and black people are living in another place, but by and large, they're interacting constantly. After the war, this starts to change. And it's partly because of textile mills. The textile mills that the Bourbons wanted in these regions. There's a couple of reasons for textile mills. One of them is it provides employment. The Bourbons also do not want to support public schools. They're not really fond of public schools. And they believe that children should be working instead of being in these schools. White children should be working. Black children should be working in the fields. White children should be working in these textile mills. And so this benefits everyone as the Bourbons see it. They don't really believe that poor white Southerners should be educated that much because it's expensive. And so they support these sort of mill towns, and they very much, literally support them by giving them tax breaks and tax abatements and things like that. And so what you have, though, is for many poor white Southerners who are growing up in mill towns, what happens is in the 60s and 70s, many people have to abandon their farms because they can't make it because cotton prices are dropping. They end up in these mill towns with their families, and they settle in these little what are called shotgun shacks, which are little shacks that are built by textile companies for white people to live in. And what we get are these sort of white-only towns almost. So basically, East Athens is their areas are where East Athens is not a good example, but other parts of Georgia where there are basically mill towns, little towns that are sort of controlled by the mill owner, and where white people see relatively few black people. These mill towns are intended to be places for white people to be educated. Another place where you see growing segregation, or at least a separation of white people and black people, is timber mills. There are basically a lot of these timber towns that kind of emerge. They harvest all the timber and then they leave. You also see relatively few African Americans in these timber regions. It's not to say that African Americans are not involved in the sort of industrial workforce. As I suggested before, many of them are trackliners. 100,000 African Americans are trackliners roughly by 1900. So there are industrial careers, but they're separated by and large from whites. And so what we see at first, going back to this really all the way back to 68 and after, with the creation of mill towns and the creation of timber towns and others, is a kind of separation of black and white people, informally, not formally. What happens, though, with the Bourbon reforms, 1890 forward, is formal segregation. What the Bourbons say is that African Americans are dangerous, they're a threat. Basically the attack on populists on the part of the Bourbons is that they they love African Americans. They love black people. They want them to, vote together. They want to make bathrooms equal and things like that between blacks and whites. And so what the Bourbons do in the 1880s and 1890s, as they gain more and more power, absolute power politically, is to introduce segregation around the time that they introduce prevent black people from voting. And this then helps us understand lynching. Lynching is a term that goes all the way back to a lynch mob, going back to the 1840s, didn't have a kind of 30s, didn't have a racial connotation initially. A lynch mob was basically Western justice, more or less, where people would find somebody who stole horses and hold a quick trial, and then supposedly Judge Lynch would intervene, and Judge Lynch would hang the person, or even tar and feather them, or whatever. So lynching in the 1830s and 1840s was a sort of somewhat Western practice, which was not necessarily aimed at African Americans. But lynching in the period of the Bourbons and afterwards, from 1870 or so onward, is a very different thing. It's where a white group of people come together. They claim that someone, usually a black man, has raped a white woman or insulted a white woman. 25% of the time, this is from the Equal Justice Project, there is a claim that black men raped white women, although there's no trial in these cases. It's basically a group of white people who come together, who take someone out of a jail cell or away from a place of work and kill them in a ritual way. And when I say a ritual way, I mean that they will. I don't want to go into too much detail about this because it's horrible, but cutting off fingers, cutting off toes, cutting off genitals, and then hanging a person. People taking souvenirs from the body of the person that's being killed. There's over 4,000 lynchings between 1875 and 1940 and in the South. But the peak, if you look at the top of this, of the lynchings, is the populist movement. The peak is the 1892 to 1894. So why is this? Why is lynching connected with this movement? Well, part of it is that in their return to power, many Southern Democrats and Bourbon Democrats claim that lynching is on the rise. That crimes against white women are on the rise. The claims now I say that 25% of the time the claims are a black man raping white women. In most cases, they're simply not calling white men mister, refusing to back down when they're struck, pushing back against a violent landowner, basically ignoring the sort of decorum of race that's emerging, that's becoming increasingly complicated. You know, that black people are not supposed to eat with white people, that black people are not supposed to knock at their front door, that black people are not supposed to, if a black man and a white man are walking down the street, the black man has to step aside for the white woman. The black man is not supposed to bump into a white woman. The black man is not. So all this sort of racial decorum, which that wasn't to say there wasn't something like that in the antebellum period, but it becomes very explicit and very defined and very complicated, and many black people find it very difficult to know what the rules are because the rules are constantly changing and they're becoming more and more crazy. Violation of these rules in just about 75% of the cases is what brings about a lynching. So there's no trial, there's no crime that's being committed. The crime is really violation of these standards. And the peak of this is the populist period, in part because many of the Democrats who come to power facing against the populists claim that the populists are making black people sassy and making black people a danger. So this is the lynching campaign that peaks in the 1890s. A couple of other things about the lynching is, in many a case, the antagonists were mill workers, many of whom had seldom met or encountered black people in a regular setting. And so what we see is a kind of what Jacqueline Hall, the historian Jacqueline Hall, calls Bible Belt pornography, a kind of story that's circulated as a rumor about what a black man has done to a white woman that gets spun up more and more into these sort of impossible tales for white people who have never seen a black person or very seldom seen a black person or very seldom interacted with a black person. These stories can create a kind of hysteria, a fear about people that they don't know or don't understand or whatever. The Bourbons, as they disfranchised black people, amplified the threat of the populists, saying that they broke the color line. The populists broke the color line, and they were a physical danger to your daughters. And they would literally say this in newspapers, and you would see this in the Atlanta Constitution and elsewhere, that the populists are threatening your daughters. Another reason that lynching emerges in this period is a slightly more complicated when it has legal implications. As fewer and fewer black people are allowed to vote, they're also not on jury, right? So when you register to vote, as soon as you register to vote, you're also registered to serve on jury duty. But black men are not on jury duty in the South. by 1890 and 91, and when this disfranchisement happens. There are relatively few of them in juries before, but there are none almost at all. And so what this allows white people to do, white terrorists to do, is to act with impunity, without any fear that they'll ever be prosecuted for killing black people. As few and few black people are allowed to vote, they can't serve on juries, and this gives law-breaking whites the opportunity to kill with impunity. The head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has written recently that no white man has ever been convicted for the over 4,000 murders of black men and women in the lynching period. The number of white men who are investigated is tiny, but the number of white men convicted is zero, precisely zero, for any of the lynchings that took place in this period. Okay, so I don't want to end with horror, and so I want to end with music. And so I want to talk about one of the weirdest legacies of lynching, and that is blues music. So I talked about blues music before. I talked about the Song of John Henry and others. And one of the things that happens in this period is, in the same period that we've been talking about, the 1880s and 1890s, is, the rise of juke joints, places where African American men come together, men and women come together, listen to music, usually performed by men with men and some women singers and performers, but often by men, with what's called open bar tuning. So it's a very basic kind of tuning of the songs, and these songs all have a gap in the middle. And let me just play. I'm not going to play this song, but I'm going to just read it for you. Get your nightshirt, mama, and then there's the colon in the middle again, and your gown, baby. Before day, we're going to shake 'em on down. Must I holler? Must I shake 'em on down? Too much jelly to be throwed away. Save this jelly till some old rainy day. Fix my supper. Let me go to bed. I ain't been in Georgia, but I've been told Georgia woman got the best jelly roll. What does shake 'em on down mean? What's that expression mean in the Buck of White song? And what's jelly roll? No, it's not shaking down from the hanging tree. No. What is jelly roll? Be careful about the limits here on what you're allowed to say. But what's you can't use what's jelly roll? Okay. Give up. Shake 'em on down is to take off your dress. Jelly roll describes a woman's private parts. One of the things that blues does is is for black men's sexuality. It's about hiding it. It's about making it invisible. About coding black men's attraction for women. In this case, likely a black woman, but black men have to take in a situation in which they are in terrible danger of being strung up for the most basic thing. What blues does is take frank descriptions of sex and put them in codes. And so that's why every blues song has at its core often a description of sex, but one that's so coded that it's kind of impossible to see. So Spread Your Wings in many of the blues songs is about spreading one's legs. All of these codes are about the ways of protecting, about communicating one's sexuality, but in a way that's safe, in a way that doesn't draw attention to oneself. In a peculiar way, the legacy of the blues is the legacy of lynching. And the legacy of lynching has a lot to do with the populist movement. Okay. Oh, kind of like WAP, right? All right. Thanks so much, everybody. And I'll see you guys on Friday on Zoom.